London was a city of secrets, but none were as cold or as silent as the walls of Blackwood Hall. They called him the Shadow Marquess, a man whose name was whispered in hushed tones behind lace fans and over tea. Silas Thorne was not just an aristocrat, he was a mystery wrapped in a black greatcoat, a man who had retreated from the world after a tragedy that no one dared to speak of. The rumors said he had a heart of flint, that he had forgotten the sound of laughter, and that he preferred the company of ghosts to the living. But for Elara Vance, the Shadow Marquess was not a ghost. He was her last hope. Standing at the towering iron gates of his estate, the wind whipping her thin cloak around her ankles, Elara felt the weight of the letter hidden in her bodice. It was a letter that shouldn't exist, a letter that carried a secret capable of shattering the Thorne lineage forever. She wasn't here to beg for charity, and she wasn't here to find a husband. She was here to deliver a truth that would either set him free or destroy them both. As the heavy doors creaked open, Elara realized that entering Blackwood Hall was like stepping into a tomb. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and wood smoke, and the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on her chest. Somewhere in the darkness of the upper floors, she heard the slow, rhythmic strike of a grandfather clock, marking the seconds of a life lived in isolation. She didn't know then that her arrival was about to ignite a fire that would burn through years of lies. She didn't know that the cold man upstairs was watching her from the shadows of the gallery, his eyes narrow and his soul weary. The game was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than any fortune. It was a scandal born of blood, a love born of necessity, and a truth that would change the history of the Ton forever. Elara followed the elderly butler down a corridor that felt miles long. Every portrait on the wall seemed to stare at her with judging eyes, their painted faces frozen in expressions of aristocratic disdain. She clutched her small satchel tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a daughter of a disgraced scholar, a woman who had spent her life surrounded by books instead of ballrooms, yet here she was, in the lion's den. When they finally reached the library, the butler bowed stiffly and disappeared, leaving her alone in a room that smelled of leather and ancient secrets. The room was vast, the shelves stretching up into the darkness, but it was the figure by the window that caught her breath. Silas Thorne stood with his back to her, looking out over the desolate snow-covered moor. He didn't turn, he didn't speak, he simply existed in that space, a pillar of silent, brooding power. Elara took a breath, trying to steady her voice. She had practiced this for weeks, but in his presence, the words felt like dust in her mouth. She had to be strong. She had to remember her father's dying wish. The silence stretched between them, becoming an entity of its own, until finally, the Marquess spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards beneath her feet. He asked her why she had come, his tone devoid of warmth or curiosity. It was the voice of a man who expected nothing from the world, and gave even less. Elara stepped forward, the light of a single candle flickering between them, and produced the letter. She told him that she carried the missing piece of his past. She saw his shoulders stiffen just for a fraction of a second, and she knew she had hit a nerve. The Shadow Marquess finally turned, and for the first time, Elara looked into eyes that were as dark and deep as a midnight sea. There was no kindness there, only a piercing intelligence and a weariness that moved her heart in a way she hadn't expected. He looked at her not as a woman, but as an intruder, a threat to the sanctuary of his grief. He warned her that some secrets were better left buried, that the truth often carried a price that no one was truly willing to pay. But Elara didn't flinch. She told him that she was prepared to pay it, if it meant justice. The air in the library grew colder, the fire in the hearth popping as a log shifted, throwing sparks against the grate. Silas walked toward her, his movements graceful and predatory, stopping just inches away. He was taller than she had imagined, a wall of dark wool and stern resolve. He reached out and took the letter, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a sudden sharp reminder that, despite his icy exterior, there was a living, breathing man beneath the layers of mourning. He broke the seal with a sharp snap, his eyes scanning the elegant script she had memorized by heart. As he read, the mask of indifference began to crack. His jaw tightened and a muscle jumped in his cheek. The letter spoke of a night 20 years ago, of a hidden marriage, and a child who was the rightful heir to everything Silas held dear. It was a scandal that could strip him of his title and cast him into the streets. Yet he didn't look afraid. He looked haunted. He looked at Elara as if seeing her for the first time, searching for her face for a sign of deception. He asked her who else knew, his voice a dangerous whisper. Elara told him that she was the only one left. Her father was gone, and the lawyer who had drafted the document was long dead. Silas crumbled the paper in his fist, his knuckles white. He told her that she was staying at Blackwood, not as a guest, but as a prisoner of the truth. He couldn't let her leave with such knowledge, and he couldn't let the world know that his entire life was built on a foundation of sand. Elara felt a surge of fear, but beneath it, a strange sense of destiny. She was in the heart of the mystery now, and there was no turning back. She was the only person in the world who truly knew the man behind the shadow. And as the snow began to fall harder against the window panes, Elara realized her journey was just beginning. The house felt alive with the weight of the past, the shadows dancing in the corners as if celebrating the return of a forgotten ghost. Silas turned back to the window, his silhouette dark against the white world outside. He told her that her room was ready, and that they would speak again in the morning. But as Elara turned to leave, she heard him murmur something, a name she didn't recognize, a name that sounded like a prayer and a curse all at once. The suspense was a living thing now, curling around them like the winter fog. What was the true secret of the Thorne family? And why did the cold Marquess look at the letter as if it were his own death warrant? The morning at Blackwood Hall brought no warmth, only a pale gray light that seemed to drain the color from the world. Elara woke in a room that felt like a museum of a life long forgotten. The heavy velvet curtains were thick with the scent of lavender and old dust, and the air was so still it felt as though time itself had stopped. As she dressed with trembling fingers, she realized the gravity of her situation. She was no longer a visitor, she was a variable in a dangerous equation. When she descended the grand staircase, the house felt even more cavernous than it had the night before. She found Silas in the breakfast parlor, though he wasn't eating. He sat at the head of a table long enough to see 20, staring at a silver pocket watch that ticked with a haunting, rhythmic precision. He didn't look up when she entered, but the tension in his jaw told her he was acutely aware of her presence. He told her that he had spent the night verifying the seal on her father's letter. His voice was sandpaper on silk, rough yet strangely captivating. He admitted that the seal was genuine, a family crest that had been missing for 2 decades. Elara took a seat far down the table, her heart racing. She asked him what it meant for the Thorne lineage. Silas finally looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. He told her that if the letter were true, he was not the Marquess of Blackwood. He was an imposter. The true heir was someone the world believed to be dead. But there was a catch, a twist that her father had hinted at but never fully explained. The letter mentioned a second document, a map hidden within the very walls of the estate that proved the bloodline. Silas stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. He told her that they were going to find that map together. He didn't trust her, but he couldn't afford to let her find it alone. As they walked toward the forbidden west wing, Elara noticed a portrait on the wall that had been slashed with a knife. The face had been removed, leaving only a hollow void in the canvas. She pointed to it, her voice a whisper. Silas stopped, his shadow falling over her like a heavy cloak. He told her that was the face of the woman who had started the fire, the woman who had almost destroyed the Thorne name once before. The suspense tightened around them as they reached a locked, heavy oak door. Silas produced a rusted key, but before he turned it, he leaned close to Elara. His voice was low, dangerous, and dangerously close to her ear. He warned her that once this door was opened, there would be no turning back to her old life. The secrets behind it were not just scandals, they were life-altering truths that the Thorne would kill to keep hidden. With a heavy click, the lock turned, and the door groaned open to reveal a room that had been sealed for 20 years. The smell of old smoke hit them instantly, and Elara realized with a jolt of horror that this was the room where the tragedy had begun. But sitting on a small table in the center of the charred room was something that didn't belong, a fresh white rose perfectly blooming in the middle of a tomb. The sight of the white rose sent a shiver down Elara's spine that had nothing to do with the winter draft. In a room that had been a tomb for 2 decades, a room heavy with the scent of charcoal and ancient grief, something was alive. Silas stepped toward the table, his hand hovering over the petals but never touching them. His face, usually a mask of granite, flickered with a raw, unspoken pain. He whispered that the rose was her favorite, his mother's favorite, but his mother had perished in the very flames that had blackened these walls. The silence of the west wing was suddenly broken by a soft metallic thud from the floor above. Both of them froze. Elara's breath caught in her throat, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They were supposed to be alone in this wing of the house. The servants were forbidden from crossing the threshold, and the villagers wouldn't come within a mile of the cursed hall. Silas reached out, his hand finding Elara's elbow and pulling her back into the deep shadows of a corner. He didn't speak, but his protective stance told her everything. There was someone else in the house. For minutes they stood in the suffocating darkness, the only sound the distant howl of the wind outside. Silas moved with the grace of a panther, crossing the charred room toward a hidden panel behind a scorched tapestry. He pressed a sequence of stones, and with a low, grinding groan, a section of the wall receded. It wasn't a room, but a narrow, winding staircase that smelled of damp earth and old parchment. He looked at Elara, his eyes dark with a new kind of intensity. He told her that if she wanted the truth, she had to follow him into the foundations of the house itself. As they descended the narrow stairs, the light from Silas's lantern cast long, dancing shadows that looked like ghostly fingers reaching for them. Elara felt a wave of dizziness, the weight of the secrets pressing in on her. She asked him why he had never looked for the map before. Silas stopped on a narrow landing, the lantern light illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He confessed that he had been afraid that the lies were the only thing keeping the Thorne name from being erased from history. But her arrival, her bravery, had changed the winds. They reached a small circular chamber deep beneath the library. In the center stood a stone pedestal with a glass case. Inside wasn't gold or jewels, but a simple leather-bound journal. As Silas reached for it, the sound of footsteps echoed clearly from the stairs they had just descended. They were being followed. Someone had waited 20 years for this journal to be found, and they weren't planning on letting the Marquess or Elara leave the cellar alive. Silas shoved the journal into Elara's hands and pointed to a small ventilation shaft. He told her to climb, to run, and to never look back. But Elara looked at the man she had thought was a monster and saw a hero. She refused to move. The door to the chamber burst open, and a figure cloaked in black stood there, a heavy iron rod in hand. The stranger didn't want the money. They wanted the journal. As Silas stepped forward to defend her, the stranger spoke, and the voice was one Silas recognized, a voice from the night of the fire. The suspense reached a breaking point as the stranger lowered their hood, revealing a face that should have been in a grave for 20 years. The real scandal was just beginning, and the danger was now a physical presence in the room. The hood fell back, and for a moment the world seemed to stop breathing. The face revealed was not that of a stranger, but one that stared back at Silas every time he looked at the family portraits in the gallery. It was a face aged by bitterness and the shadows of the underground, but the eyes were unmistakable. It was his uncle, Lord Percival, the man who was supposed to have perished in the Great Fire alongside Silas's father. The air in the small chamber turned thick with the scent of old grudges. Percival didn't move like a ghost. He moved like a man who had spent 20 years fueled by a cold, simmering rage.
He looked at the journal in Elara's trembling hands and smiled, a jagged, mirthless expression that made her blood run cold. He claimed that the journal was never meant for Silas, that the Thorne legacy was a crown of thorns he had been waiting to reclaim. Silas stepped in front of Elara, his body a solid shield of refined fury. He asked his uncle how he could have lived in the shadows of his own home for so long, watching his nephew mourn a family that wasn't entirely gone. Percival laughed, a hollow, dry sound that echoed off the damp stone walls. He confessed that the fire hadn't been an accident. It had been a botched attempt to take everything at once, and when it failed, he had retreated into the sprawling, forgotten tunnels of Blackwood Hall, waiting for the moment the map to the true family fortune surfaced. The suspense was like a physical weight in the room. Percival raised the iron rod, his eyes fixed on the journal. He offered Elara a choice: give him the book and walk away with her life, or stay and be buried in the foundations of the house she had so foolishly entered. Elara looked at Silas. She saw the pain of a man who had just realized his entire life of grief was a lie orchestrated by the man standing before them. She knew then that she couldn't run. In a sudden, desperate movement, Elara didn't hand over the journal. Instead, she threw her lantern at the base of the pedestal. The glass shattered, and for a split second, a wall of flame erupted between them and Percival. It wasn't enough to stop him forever, but it was enough of a distraction. Silas grabbed Elara's hand, his grip firm and grounding, and pulled her toward a second, smaller exit, a crawlspace that led toward the old wells. They scrambled through the narrow passage, the sounds of Percival's enraged shouts muffled by the stone. They could hear a frantic beating of their own heart, but beneath it, they felt a strange new clarity. They weren't just a messenger anymore. They were Silas's only ally. They emerged into the freezing night air, miles from the main house, near the ruins of an old chapel. The snow was falling in thick, heavy blankets now, erasing their footprints as soon as they made them. Silas turned to her, his breath huffing in white clouds. He told her that they couldn't go back to the hall. Not yet. He had to know what was in the journal, the truth that was so valuable his own blood had stayed in the dark for 20 years to find it. As they huddled for warmth inside the stone ruins, Elara opened the book. The pages were filled with her father's elegant script, but there were also notes from Silas's mother. It was a map, yes, but not to gold. It was a map to a hidden marriage certificate, one that proved Silas was the rightful heir, but also proved that Percival had no claim to the title even if Silas were gone. The twist was a dagger to the heart. Silas's father had known of Percival's greed and had hidden the proof to protect his son. Silas looked at the pages, and for the first time, Elara saw a single tear track through the soot on his cheek. The Iron Duke was breaking, and only she was there to see the pieces fall.
The stone ruins of the old chapel provided little shelter from the biting London winter, but for the first time in his life, Silas Thorne felt a warmth that had nothing to do with a hearth fire. As the snow piled against the ancient moss-covered walls, Elara carefully turned the pages of the journal, her voice steady as she read the truth that had been buried in the dark for 20 years. Silas listened, his heart heavy with the realization that his father's last act had been one of immense love and protection. The journal detailed how his father had discovered Percival's embezzling and his dark obsession with the title. He had hidden the true marriage certificate and the lineage records in a place Percival would never look, not in a safe or a vault, but within the hollowed-out base of the statue of the family's matriarch in the center of the garden. The wind howled through the roofless chapel, sounding like the cries of the ghosts they were trying to appease. Silas looked at Elara, the lantern light reflecting in her eyes, and he knew he could no longer play the part of the brooding recluse. He had to be the man his father believed he could be. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the parchment. He told her that they had to return to Blackwood Hall tonight. Percival would be searching the tunnels, thinking they were trapped or dead. but he wouldn't expect them to walk through the front doors. They needed to retrieve the documents and end the charade before the law was called by the very man who had broken it. The journey back was a test of endurance. Every shadow in the woods seemed to take the shape of a cloaked figure, and every snap of a frozen branch sounded like a pistol shot. Elara stumbled in the deep drifts, her strength waning, but Silas was there every time to catch her, his arm a solid, unwavering support. He didn't speak, but the way he shielded her from the wind told a story of a growing bond that transcended the scandal they were fighting. When the dark, jagged silhouette of Blackwood Hall finally appeared through the storm, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress occupied by an enemy. They avoided the main gates, slipping through the servants' entrance which had been left unbolted in the chaos of the night. The house was unnaturally silent. The staff had been sent to bed, and the only light came from the dying embers in the great hall. Silas led Elara toward the gardens, the snow blinding and fierce. They reached the statue, a cold marble figure of a woman holding a laurel wreath. With a heavy iron crowbar he had snatched from the tool shed, Silas began to prise at the base. The sound of metal on stone seemed to echo for miles, and Elara stood guard, her eyes darting toward the darkened windows of the west wing. Just as the stone slab gave way, revealing a leaden box, a voice sliced through the wind. It was cold, sharp, and laced with a terrifying calm. Percival stood on the terrace, a lantern in one hand and a heavy walking stick in the other. He hadn't been in the tunnels. He had been watching them from the balcony the entire time. He walked down the steps, his limp more pronounced in the cold, a predatory smile stretching his thin lips. He told them he was impressed by their tenacity, but that a piece of paper couldn't stop a man who had already been dead to the world for 2 decades. The suspense reached a fever pitch as Silas stood his ground, the leaden box clutched in his hand. He told his uncle that the game was over, the truth was out of the shadows, and Blackwood Hall would no longer be a sanctuary for a murderer. Percival lunged forward, surprising them with his speed, and the 2 men struggled in the snow. Elara grabbed the box, her fingers numb with cold, and ran toward the house to find the butler, the only man whose testimony could back the documents. Behind her, she heard the sounds of the struggle, the heavy thuds and the gasps for air. She didn't look back until she reached the heavy oak doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to save the man who had finally opened his heart to the world, even if it meant facing the ghost of the hall one last time. The heavy oak doors of Blackwood Hall swung open, the warmth of the foyer a stark contrast to the freezing betrayal unfolding in the garden. Elara's voice rang out through the silent corridors, calling for the household. Within moments, the butler and the senior staff appeared, their faces pale as they saw the soot-stained woman clutching a leaden box. With trembling hands, Elara produced the marriage certificate and the letters of lineage. The butler, a man who had served the Thorne family for 40 years, took one look at the signature of the late Marquess and fell into a heavy silence. He didn't need to read the words. He knew the truth that had been hidden in his own heart for too long. Outside, the struggle reached its breaking point. Silas, fueled by the memory of his father and the courage Elara had brought into his life, managed to disarm Percival. The older man fell back into the snow, his strength finally failing him. But it wasn't a blow that defeated him. It was the sight of the hall's windows suddenly glowing with light as every lamp in the house was lit. The servants, led by the butler, marched onto the terrace, their faces set in grim realization. Percival looked at the crowd and knew that his reign of shadows was over. He had lived in the dark for 20 years, and the light was a sun he could no longer bear. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the swirling blizzard, choosing the cold embrace of the moors over the judgment of the world. He was never seen again. A ghost finally returned to the mist. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the snow in shades of soft pink and gold, the atmosphere inside Blackwood Hall shifted. The heavy, oppressive silence that had defined Silas's life was gone. The leaden box was placed on the library table, its contents securing Silas's place not just as the Marquess, but as a man of honor. He found Elara by the fireplace, her hands finally warming by the flames. He didn't approach her as the Shadow Marquess or the Iron Duke. He approached her as a man who had finally found his way home. He stood before her, the firelight catching the gold in her hair and the softness in her eyes. He told her that Blackwood Hall had been a tomb, but she had turned it back into a house. He confessed that the greatest scandal wasn't the secret his uncle had kept, but the fact that he had almost let his heart wither away before he met her. He didn't offer her a contract or a secret. He offered her a life of peace, of shared books in the library, and of gardens that would finally grow roses in the spring. Elara looked up at him, a radiant smile breaking across her face, a smile that promised a future brighter than any London season. She told him that she hadn't come for the Marquess, she had come for the man. And as the household staff began to open the heavy velvet curtains, letting the fresh winter light fill the rooms, the shadows of the past finally dissolved. There was no scandal left to hide, only a legacy of truth. Silas and Elara stood together at the window, watching the world wake up. The coldest heart in London had finally melted, and for the first time in 20 years, the bells of the village chapel rang out in celebration. The Thorne name was restored, the secret was told, and they lived the rest of their days in a light that never faded.